Hi everyone. Welcome to e-flux. It's a real pleasure to introduce JP Caron, Reza Negarestani, and Patricia Reed, who will be joining us via Skype. I should mention that for those of us who are interested in being alerted and knowing about events that are happening here, there's a list by the bar where you can sign up, so you are notified when we do stuff here at e-flux. The title of our evening tonight, the focus of our evening, is Generative Aesthetics. In Peter Strawson's 1959 book, Individuals, he proposes a thought experiment for which one imagines a no-space world. The model is a purely auditory world, wherein one only has access to auditory phenomena and must suspend entrenched concepts of spatial and material reality. Strawson's exercise asks if we would re-identify particulars in such a framework where the coordinates of localization of ordinary experience are completely reformulated. While his investigations remain inconclusive, they offer a compelling example of the exercise that tonight we are calling generative aesthetics. Generative aesthetics is interested in reconfiguring ordinary experience and concepts typically taken as givens in order to produce counterfactually new worlds. It is interested in the question, what does it take to remake perception and experience? Such an inquiry is also related to what philosopher Nelson Goodman called worldmaking, practices of constituting worlds through our aesthetic, scientific, philosophical, and political ideas. So we'll start tonight with JP Caron. We'll move on to Patricia, joining us via Skype. Hello, Patricia, if you are watching from the ether, and then end with Reza. By way of introduction, Patricia Reed is an artist, writer, and designer based in Berlin. Her recent texts have been published in Glass Bead Journal, e-flux Journal, Post Memes, The New Normal, and Construction Site for Possible Works. Reza Negarestani is a philosopher. His major works include Cyclonopedia, Complicity with Anonymous Materials, Intelligence and Spirit, and the upcoming Abducting the Outside collected writings from 2003 to 2018, which maybe is out already? Okay, still forthcoming, okay. And to introduce our first speaker for the evening, JP Caron is a philosopher and artist based in Rio de Janeiro, Brazil. He is a lecturer in philosophy at the Federal University of Rio, and he militates in the Circle of Studies of the Idea of and Ideology, an international political collective dedicated to examining the viability of the communist hypothesis today. He's been practicing noise and experimental music for more than 15 years, and several of his records have been released, many through his own imprint, Seminal Records. Please join me in giving a warm welcome to JP Caron.
Hello. Good evening. I shall thank you for having us in this evening. I also shall apologize because English is not my first language, so I'll be much more comfortable reading my stuff than improvising in that foreign language. So don't get any blanks and anything like that. So. I'll be talking mainly about the two philosophers that Brian mentioned that were mentioned in the blurb for the event, namely Peter Strawson and Nelson Goodman. But the main subject is a third one. I would use them just as a background in order to understand the contributions of a third one, which is Henry Flint. Particularly his notion of constitutive dissociation, that I think it's crucial for any project regarding what we are calling generative aesthetics. So the paper is mainly an introduction to that concept in comparison to these other forerunners of this notion. Okay, I should just start. Well, the title is On Constitutive Dissociations as Generative Aesthetics. Okay. In one of a series of video interviews from 2005, Harry Flint mentioned at some point his involvement with the science fiction scene of the time. I mean, yeah, there's a problem right there because the video is from 2005, and he's talking about 1969, okay, at the time of 1969, okay? Coming from a background in mathematics and analytic philosophy, in addition to his radical Marxist phase, Flint took an interest precisely in the more speculative aspects of sci-fi, not so much in its penchant for appealing to a wide audience of pulp consumers. He mentioned being concerned with the rationality of humanity as such, and of coming out of Marxism, and coming out of Marxism by thinking of the implausibility of Marx's proposal to have communism while still having humans as raw material. During the video interview, he mentions a few pamphlets that he wrote and took with him to meetings of sci-fi writers to discover, shockingly, that there was no interest whatsoever in that aspect of the culture, and conversations drift quickly to the current state of the market for sci-fi writing and else. I take interest in such an anecdote, since we are in a time where there is much more prestige to sci-fi, which acquires quasi-philosophical status as a medium where different worlds are fashioned, sometimes in hard sci-fi, in continuity and guided by current notions of our current science. Coming out of the New York avant-garde of the 60s, it would be easy to miscategorize Flint as basically a happening artist or an artist of the happenings, right? Or a Fluxus associate. But his engagement with philosophy, math, economics, Marxist politics, experimental music, and conceptual art testifies to a much ampler scale of his thought. Much wider, sorry. My aim is not to defend Flint's philosophical thesis, most of which I'm not in agreement with, but to show him to be consistently guided by a project throughout all of these engagements, a project that consists of nothing short of refashioning entirely human culture and experience. As such, Flint's thought ought to be counted as an important stage in the project of generative aesthetics and of radical philosophy today, even though he dislikes intensely the label philosophy. I feel compelled at first to try and articulate some elements of what we are calling generative aesthetics. Anything I might be able to say, though, will be tentative, as generative aesthetics is not a discipline with clear boundaries, but a cluster of related questions concerning our structures of apprehension, comprehension, and their counterfactual suspension. This formulation holds already several presuppositions to be unpacked. I will unpack them in two phases. First, I will give a preliminary and programmatic idea by commenting on two different approaches to the problems of generative aesthetics that touch on two different levels to be pursued in these investigations. The first will be briefly the experiment of thought conceived by Peter Strawson, as mentioned by Brian, in the second chapter of his Individuals book, the book that's called, that has this title, from 1959, wherein he imagines the possibility of a no-space world, modeling it upon what he proposes to be a purely auditory world, a world without given objecthood, but composed solely of sounds. This is a way to bracket the particular way our forms of intuition are entangled, even if this bracketing wasn't per se the objective of Strawson's thought experiment, rather a means to test the persistence of certain properties of our actual perceptual framework. The second will be Nelson Goodman's notion of world-making as a term encapsulating prima facie the idea of the theory-ladenness of our judgments of knowledge, in the sense that there isn't such a thing as a framework-independent knowledge. Much in the sense also that much of what we take the world to be like is a result of a conceptual contraptions of our own making, and secondarily, the epistemological purview of what Goodman calls non-verbal world versions. The idea that even if our artistic aesthetic practices aren't immediately thought of as producing knowledge claims, they are informing what we take the world to be, once the idea of a framework-independent world is out of the window. So in a sense, both scientific theories and artistic practices are world-constituting activities. After these initial examples, I would like to tackle a particular idea of Flint's, namely what he calls constitutive dissociations. The definition of this will be given at the right moment, but for now I could say that I intend to present constitutive dissociations as a means of world-making in two flavors that parallel two examples given of generative aesthetics. The conceptual refashioning of our seeings as, in the sense of seeing something as something, which is a conceptual matter, the subsumption of a particular under universal concept, in the sense of Goodman, and the determination of intuitive contents themselves, like a different determination, almost like a redetermination, paralleling Strawson's thought experiment. At the end, I shall briefly compare Flint's anti-cognitivist stance with the idea of world-making as a cognitive ideal, in which to know is to conceive in a rather technical sense. So generative aesthetics pertains to a reflection upon the conditions of our experience, understood here in the Kantian sense of an integration of faculties, a particular integration, namely sensibility, imagination, and understanding. The investigation led by Strawson purports to examine if we can make sense of numerical identity in a world integrating intuition devoid of space. Numerical identity ought to be understood as the identity of a particular item, the identification of x with x, x equals x. Strawson's argument proposes to imagine a world without space, modeled on the idea of a purely auditory experience, and proceeds to ask then if one can make sense of the coordinates that enable identification and re-identification of particular items. To put it more rigorously, if one can find in such a purely auditory experience the analogs of our actual coordinates for locating and relocating particulars within a temporal spatial frame of reference. This is Strawson's question. Strawson's investigation is inconclusive. I was going to develop a little more on this, but I think we won't have the time, actually. Strawson's investigation is inconclusive, but it serves as an example of a thought experiment that investigates the conditions themselves of our perceptual conceptual experience. Strawson's intent, though, wasn't of proposing a frame of reference different from our own, but testing the survival of the properties of localization and re-identification that are characteristic of our frame of reference, transferred to a different frame of reference. In this sense, Strawson's idea is a conservative one. The maintenance of an actual frame of reference and the departures from it serve the purpose merely of validating that so-called frame of reference. Something quite different will become apparent with Flint's approach. But before proceeding to the Flintian approach, let me briefly sketch the Goodmanian ideal of world-making as a way to understand the ontological/epistemological consequences of generative aesthetics that is fundamentally different from Strawson's descriptive metaphysics. Whereas in the project of descriptive metaphysics, Strawson is overtly trying to describe the actual categorical structure of our experience, explicitly against what he calls revisionary metaphysics, that thrives to replace this categorical structure with another. In Ways of World-Making, Goodman stresses the fact that we live in an important sense not in a world, but in several different worlds. I quote Goodman, "Consider to begin with the statements. The sun always moves, and the sun never moves, which, though equally true, are at odds with each other. Shall we say, then, that they describe different worlds, and indeed that there are as many different worlds as there are such mutually exclusive truths? Rather, we are inclined to regard the two strings of words not as complete statements with truth values of their own, but as elliptical for some such statements as, under frame of reference A, the sun always moves, and, second one, under frame of reference B, the sun never moves. Statements that may both be true of the same world, because they are relativized to the frame of reference. Then this kind of makes them compatible to one and the same world. Frames of reference, but this is not the whole story. For here you have like a sketch of a kind of relativism, right? Actually, a pacification of different relative frames of reference. But this is not the whole story. Frames of reference, though, seem to belong less to what is described than to systems of description, and each of the two statements relates what is described to such a system. But if I ask about the world, you can offer to tell me how it is under one or more frames of reference. But if I insist that you tell me how it is apart from all frames, what can you say? We are confined to ways of describing whatever is described. But even if we are, now, end of quote, but even if we are confined to the different descriptions we have with reference to what is being described, we are not confined to descriptions only. For Goodman, there are different ways of referring besides verbal description, ways that constitute our own non-verbal symbolizing practices, such as artistic aesthetic practice, that symbolize through denotation, yes, but also through classification, expression, and exemplification. More detailed examination of such routes of reference is beside the point of this presentation. Even if Strawson's objective was to arrive at a description of the actual categorical structure of our experience, while Goodman is bracketing the existence of such actual categorical, as a singular actual categorical structure, through the evicting of a world as such, both are presented here as exercises in generative aesthetics, in the sense that these are approaches that either purport to reimagine the coordinates and conditions of experience as such, or make both, or are trying to make this idea philosophically viable. But they occur at different levels of the constitution of such worlds. Whereas the thought experience with the no-space world is specifically concerned with intuition and perception understood as conceptually articulated intuition, Goodman's ideal of world-making, conversely, deals more with intuition's field conceptual manipulation. The different ways of seeing something as something that results from symbolizing activities are downstream to the choice and constitution of different frameworks with which to articulate such contents. I shall briefly propose two different uses of Flint's constitutive dissociations that parallel the two different kinds of generative aesthetical intervention, illustrated both by Goodman and Strawson, respectively, the downstream determination of perception. The downstream determination of perception through the choice of different frameworks, and the upstream changing of our conceptual contents through the reimagining of perceptual contents. So, finally, Flint's definition of constitutive dissociation. He's mentioning a bunch of compositions, particularly Lamont Young's compositions 1960, that he takes to be exercises in what he's calling constitutive dissociation. So he starts by mentioning, referring to them. I find a principle running through these cases, which I call constitutive dissociation. Constitutive dissociations presuppose a genre with a standard protocol. In the genre, situations are established by ordainments. A reality exists because of somebody's rule. Moreover, it is customary in the genre for situations to have certain aims. A constitutively dissociated situation comes about because the instigator of the situation alters the aims of the genre from the customary aims without declaring so. Since the traditional aims are foregone, the instigator can evade or replace standard protocol with an inscrutable protocol, a contrived enigma. This end of quote. I would phrase it somewhat differently, since I find it rather unclear the difference between a component of a situation and the aims of the situation. I mean, what is the aims, really, the aim of any situation? This is kind of obscure to me. So I would rephrase the idea of constitutive dissociation as a kind of revision of components of a certain infrastructural normative space that functions as a pattern for action, right? So if the action is characterized by a certain wiring diagram, or could be, if I talk more rigorously, could be described by a certain specific wiring diagram. What a constitutive dissociation is basically a severing of certain ties within the diagram or a revision of certain hubs in this diagram. Okay? This is my take on constitutive dissociations. It is important to get some of the objects of Flint's analysis here. These compositions would result from actions, gestures, which may or may not be determined by a score, often in the form of a verbal text. So those compositions by Lamontiang are usually small cards with some imperative, some phrases in the imperative, either some description, sometimes a figure, sometimes a little bit of musical writing, musical notation, okay? So, experiences such as these Lamontian compositions remain classics of the time, with their orders summarized in small cards such as draw a straight line and follow it. This is one of the cards. These experiments constitute an initial departure from what appears as the characteristic work concept of the European tradition, a configuration that is determined in its details and which performance in concert must respect. This is what I have called in other texts the normative turn that's characteristic of the post-Cajun tradition, a tendency to incorporate the elements that make the work a work, the normative elements, not just the content, downstream from the conditions that are responsible for the constitution of those contents. The act of reading a score, the desideratum of respecting its limits, performing before an audience, etc. Incorporating these elements that make the work a work within the work itself. Thus, the works of the normative turn would have as aesthetic material the very act of playing a work. Its characteristic protocols and ordainments, as exemplified clearly by Tony Coran's work that says, in order to play that piece, do not play this piece, or Flint's own work such that no one knows what's going on, which comes down to its title and the possible imaginative process that it feeds or yields. What would a piece look like such that no one knows it exists? How many pieces like this there are? This paradox refers to the ontological, is this okay? Just a sec. Yeah, the ontological question posed by Quine in his classic On What There Is. Take, for instance, I quote Quine, take, for instance, the possible fat man in that doorway. And again, the possible bald man in that doorway. Are they the same possible man or two possible men? How do we decide how many possible men are there in that doorway? End of quote. Proposals such as this presuppose for Flint a new art form whose raw material would be words or concepts. For me, not words or concepts, but because I am committed to a certain concept of concept as a function of inferences, right? So the raw material would be this normative infrastructure itself, in the sense of being the rules for action, which can be unpacked as, or conversely, can be packed as being concepts. This is theorized in the article Concept Art from 1963, which reads, in which we can read, concept art is first of all an art of which the material is concepts, as the material of, for example, music is sound. Since concepts are clearly bound up with language, concept art is a kind of art of which the material is language. That is, unlike, for example, a work of music, in which the music proper, as opposed to notation, analysis, and so on, is just sound, concept art proper will involve language. In this concept art article, we find an important critique of the computational paradigm of European concept music, which Flint calls structure art. I quote him again. Much structure art is a vestige of the time when, for example, music was believed to be knowledge, a science which had important things to say in astronomy and so on. Contemporary structure artists on the other hand, tend to claim the kind of cognitive value for their art that conventional contemporary mathematicians claim for mathematics. Modern examples of structure art are the fugue and the total serial music. End of quote. Thus, for Flint, structure art, in the case of music, would be an art form in which sounds are vehicles for maintaining and communicating a structure. In his later writing called Against Participation, a total critique of culture, Flint clarifies the whys of his critique. My earliest surviving survey is Concept Art from 1961. In that document, my propose is criticizing structure art, and in undermining mathematics was to announce concept art as a new genre. Roughly, concept art explores the aesthetics of categorization in works which serve as object critiques of the exact sciences. It was this last requirement which was never understood by the artists who adopted my phrase for their word pieces. So Flint saw consequences for the exact sciences from these artistic practices that dealt with this kind of constitutive dissociations. Flint sustains a twofold criticism against the structural art, the structure art form. First, against the cognitive claims of the structure that he had already made to mathematics in other texts, so that the pretense of knowledge has been taken out of the way of mathematics itself, or of structure itself in structure art. Its purpose becomes superfluous. This is his basic anti-cognitivist position that he calls cognitive nihilism. The second criticism is directed against the anemia of its own structure, of the music side. It's basically dividing structure art, for instance, in the sense of structure music, between a structural side and like a sensuous side. Both them suffer from impoverishment because they are bound up with each other. So if you sever the ties between the structure and the sensuous, you get more richness. If you believe Flint, you get more richness because the conceptual side is free, untethered from the necessary relationship to a sensible intuition, right? This is the basic idea. Concept art becomes a way of releasing the abstract structure of its sensitive vehicle. Now, with free concepts, it is possible to create more complex and interesting logical structures. A few interesting points emerge from this brief account of constitutive dissociations. Constitutive dissociations are to be understood as interventions in the conceptual order that conditions action. That means its theoretical import is mediated through a specific practice, even if that practice is theoretical practice, like in the Althusserian sense. B, although constitutive dissociations are embodied in practices, the particular severings mobilized in a particular dissociation is able to reconceptualize components of how the world is taken to be. See, the similarity to the ideal of world-making notwithstanding, Flint's take on this is acognitive, the very fact that interventions could be made that change piece by piece the framework in which both experience and thought are conducted is for Flint the hallmark of a cognitive culture to be pursued. Logical elaboration is understood then as obeying to an aesthetic requirement in the sense of the beautiful, not in the sense of the true. D, so instead of reconceptualizing knowledge as such, as with Goodman, Flint is proposing a relinquishing of the ideal of knowledge in favor of a different picture altogether of our relationship to the world. One of the most interesting, and now this was like the first, as I announced, there was like two different versions of constitutive dissociations. One that would affect conceptual articulation upstream from sensible concepts. This was the one, like the idea of concept art, the severing from intuitive contents in order to have more robust and more different, more diversified, and more, in a sense, even bizarre kind of conceptual articulations, as conceptual articulations are taken to be a material for certain interventions that are also not necessarily conducive to knowledge as such. This I'm not with him on this point, but it is I'm trying to represent also his view as faithfully as possible. So the second one is in the Strawson sense, the reconceptualization of the intuitive side, downstream from this upstream conceptual order, okay? One of the most interesting examples of such relinquishing is motivated by Flint's analysis of Marian Zazila's installation, The Magenta Lights. I quote Flint again. Substantially, each of the mobiles, the Magenta Lights consists of two mobiles with a certain shapes and two kinds of lights that are projected onto them, resulting in 6 visual, perceptual mobiles, 2 of which are real, and 4 of which are shadows, okay? And the movements of these mobiles are projecting different shapes onto the wall that are kind of difficult to retrace unless you accept a certain world object framework. It's different to retrieve the relationship of the objects and the shadows. And that is the case also because you don't really know which one are the real ones and which ones are the shadows. So Flint describes it as substantially each of the mobiles in the Magenta Lights was white aluminum annulus with a single radial cut. Each strip hung from 3 points so as to become helical. From opposite sides of the 2 mobiles in a quadrant, beams of magenta light and blue light were directed at the mobiles. The mobiles were moved by slight convection currents and ventilation, and thus were moved independently and non-deterministically. I would take issue with that term, but okay. At rare moments, the 2 mobiles in a quadrant would come into phase, and then the line of 6 images would exhibit isometric mirror symmetry about the midpoint. End of quote. This will be my second example of constitutive dissociation. I'm also almost finished, okay? One at the level of the integration of perceptual contents. Flint understands the so-called illusory effects of Zazila's work. 6 perceptual mobiles, the position of which are complex projections of shadows from 2 real, inverted commas, mobiles, as an opportunity for a reintegration of the life world under different prescriptions. That means by dissociating perception from the object world framework in a somewhat similar way that both the concept and the sensible get severed one from the other in his critique of structure art, one can envisage perceptual variations that are impossible to have, such that are impossible to have veridical character under the object world framework. I quote, the installation's illusory character allowed one to take it as an epistemology laboratory, as an opportunity to re-examine common sense perceptions of the object. In the 20th century, academic philosophy brought forth an epistemology which proposed that one could, by looking properly at one saw in front of oneself, perceptually infer the uniquely correct substantial object or display. One possible label for this academic epistemology is comprehension. My reflections militate against comprehension. It contributes to a new enterprise, which finds conventional reality to be a fiction, not at the level of theoretical conceptualization, but at the level of perceived objects. Unfortunately, I won't have the time here to approach the details of his take on Zazila's installation, but the full epistemological consequences of constitutive dissociations can be drawn finally from this quote. As much as the word pieces were thought of as object critiques of the exact sciences in the conceptual order, proposing local disintegrative, reintegrative procedures at the level of concepts, possible inferences, Flint's understanding of Zazila's work yield a possible reconceptualization of our field of experience, much akin to the Strawsonian reconstruction, wherein the identity of particular substantial objects, the identities aren't taken for granted, but which construction in the perceptual field is reactivated anew by the bracketing of habitual categorizations and the judgments that pertain to the continued existence of physical concretions. Whereas this serves Flint as a motivator of a global acognitive anti-realism that is supposed to surpass current science and current civilization, for me, the main thrust of constitutive dissociations is methodological. It is a logical tool for the reconfiguration of contents, both in the conceptual and in the sensible order, in the sense that Flint himself puts forward when he suggests it as an epistemological laboratory. Constitutive dissociations are to be understood as a meta-protocol for constructing practices and worldviews to be further tested against one another. As such, it is a means for the untethering of thought and experience from what is taken by common sense to be the case, thus furthering the project of generative aesthetics beyond the validation of current world configurations. Thank you.
Are you doing questions for JP, or do I just start?
You will start.
I just start, okay. And I promise I won't do any obscene hand gestures behind your back while you're speaking in the event tonight, so unless it's a really strong disagreement. So thanks again for thanks for having me. I'm actually joining you from Seoul, so it's like already Halloween here in the morning. And yeah, I'm going to kind of present some ideas I've been working on, which actually coalesce quite serendipitously with your sort of unleashing of this concept of generative aesthetics. But they may be a little bit rough still, so apologies for that, but hopefully it will make sense and kind of stimulate some sort of discussion. So I've been basically working on a concept of non-adaptive artifacts. So there is some kind of resonance with this dissociative, sorry, I'm still kind of waking up here. What was it? The constitutive dissociation. So there's definitely some kind of resonance there. So I'll just kind of explain how I got to this idea and then sort of weave it back into this counterfactual world. So yeah, basically when we use the word artifact, we usually tend to think of it as a kind of object or thing in the past, like a kind of residue of a human culture that, of course, in many regions just sort of like gets collected and protected in climate-controlled glass cases. So artifacts aren't just traces of human social life, but in the present, they also serve as vehicles to access those histories. So they make those ways of coexistence to which they are attached, like the historical moments that they're attached, they make them intelligible to us. So rather than thinking of history in this kind of reductive sense of, merely placing an inventory of these kind of objects along a timeline, I think the more important thing that these objects speak to is the discursive predispositions that underwrite certain areas. And as a result, they kind of help us understand the foundational, a priori frames of reference that sort of govern a particular moment of time. And through the interaction with an artifact, we can actually come to question, like why a certain function was desired from an object within a particular human culture, to what root assumptions about the necessity or use value of that function, and what picture of the human does this artifact or technique of representation conform? So that's sort of like why I've selected this kind of object of the artifact. And of course, the name that philosopher Michel Foucault gave to these historical a priori frames of reference is the episteme. And it's through this concept I think we can better grasp in the first place, like how the coordination of ordinary experience is formed, right? I mean, if we're using this category ordinary, then we have to understand how do we build the ordinary in a sense, right? The ordinary it doesn't just fall from the sky. So this will prove necessary if the project of generative aesthetics is the reformulation of the coordinates of localization of ordinary experience. So basically, what grounds an experience as ordinary in the first place? So Foucault's concept of the episteme was outlined in The Order of Things, and it was precisely elaborated in order to understand, quote, the implicit systems which determine our most familiar behavior, to show their formation and the constraint they impose upon us, end quote. So for Foucault, the episteme is a kind of site upon which knowledge is positively grounded, and he very often uses the word site to describe this, which is interesting. So it operates as a kind of historical discursive home, a broad notion, of course, of being at home that is, I would claim, no less domestic simply because it's deprivatized. So this historical discursive home serves as a kind of given space of order prior to words, perceptions, and gestures, which are essentially affirmative, what he calls happy expressions of that particular order. Quote, more solid, more archaic, less dubious, and always more true than the theories that attempt to give those expressions explicit form, end quote. So this historical discursive home of which Foucault speaks is the a priori mode of being, structuring the seemingly spontaneous cultural experience of the relationship between things, the taxonomies for those relations. So this is what he calls the organization of sameness and difference, and the principles and disciplines by which they, must be deliberated. So the episteme is kind of largely concerned with the site of site of enablement that governs knowledge practices in a specific way, and also how those feed into the possibility space for experience. So the domesticity implied by the episteme attempts to explain the relationship between thought and culture by excavating the foundational space undergirding the construction of certain structures of knowledge. And these are the ones that determine what is possible and impossible to think, what is relevant and irrelevant to question. So although we can tinker with the arrangement of things within a given episteme, and of course a degree of surface change can be experienced, ultimately paradigmatic transformation happens at the level of this site from which the construction of thought is primarily referenced. So the episteme doesn't prioritize a sort of linear progress of knowledge, but is interesting because it accounts for discontinuities. Insofar as there are historical moments where it is simply no longer possible to think a certain thought or engage in the game of reasoning on the same basis. So Foucault is ultimately interested in why those possibilities and impossibilities come into being, not, of course, to affirm them, but to, quote, place oneself at a distance from them to show how one could escape. So I think this is kind of where an interesting link can be drawn between, I'm envisioning this episteme as a kind of enclosure, and the ways it grounds frames of reference shape the construction of the ordinary or the familiar, of course, including the types of experiences afforded by those frames of reference. So the equation would then go, excuse me, to change the conditions of experience, to change the possibility space for experience, a change must occur at the level of these frames of reference that ultimately structure conditions of enablement and constraint. And I think it's important to add that fold into understandings of how we understand what is necessity, truth, goodness, use value, and so on. So obviously, this simple equation is obviously much easier said or thought than done or experienced, pointing to a kind of critical difference between knowing that and knowing how. And I think this is very interesting that we're bringing back in this this aesthetic dimension, because that's obviously how can I say, I know myself as a practicing artist, I get very frustrated with the ability to formulate dazzling abstractions, but then when it comes to how to imagine these actualized, it's something quite other. So yeah, basically, you know, and this is not just like a philosophical problem, right? This is kind of an urgent pragmatic problem. As we're confronting, you know, climate catastrophe as this entanglement of Earth's social, economic, and technological systems, including our own species extinction. Any notion of futurity that is without an escape route from these existing historical discursive constraints, and of course the resulting normative commitments that have enabled such a condition, is naive at best. So I think the question is, how can artistic practices participate in the production of prehistorical artifacts for another world? How can we participate in creating conditions of experience where it's no longer possible to think like that, or repeat the same justifications for reasoning as before? So the second sort of step in this proposition about non-adaptive artifacts comes by way of Sylvia Wynter and her important sort of augmentations or extensions to the episteme. So for Wynter, the sort of paradigm change urged on by the prospect of escaping the given episteme is bound to transformations of the concept of being human. So her claim is that human self-conception, it comes even before the episteme as a primary frame of reference. It's a regionally specific conceptual figuration from which social and epistemic arrangements are organized in its likeness. So as a particular genre of being human, to use her expression, this idealized human concept, it kind of operates like a template for human forms and so-called you know, proper activities, motivations, behaviors. And moreover, it's an idealization that is materially reproduced through social structures that incentivize adaptation to the human genre concept belonging to that particular region and historical period. So this self-troping feedback loop, or what Wynter, following Frantz Fanon, names as the sociogenic principle, it effectively naturalizes a specific concept of being human while excluding all beings and entities not in compliance with it. So this human genre concept is then internalized as an immutable fact of nature, one, of course, that is often unconsciously practiced, shaping both knowledge claims and organizations of social life in accordance with its self-conception. So this, in many ways, the very concept of a human is a kind of artifact unto itself, a conceptual artifact of a given historical era. So it's due to these structuring, the structuring force of these habituating frames of reference, you know, underwriting a particular era via this human self-idealization, that Wynter highlights an important distinction between the production of what she calls genre-specific orders of truth, as opposed to truth in general. Because of this tendency towards human genre conforming truths, or what Catherine McKittrick referred to as adaptive truths, Wynter, you know, self-critically addresses the roles intellectuals often play in rehearsing or perpetuating these frames of reference that structure conditions of possibility or impossibility, inclusion and exclusion, sameness and difference of a particular era. So correspondingly, it's important to you know, also self-critically note that we artists are not immune to this tendency either. So we must also reflect upon our own predispositions, asking if they too do not fall into this adaptive truth category as well, merely reinforcing given historical discursive constraints, including, of course, what the human genre concept is, despite claims of hypercriticality or what may appear as an instance of radical novelty. So the blind or unconscious reinforcement of current genres of being human, which is of course entangled with this given historical discursive constraints, is what can be framed as an arrested historical mode of practice. And it's for this mode that I propose the term adaptive artifact. So grappling with what it means to have a history, as Reza Negarestani has written, is rather to work for historical incompletion, to labor against the perception of inevitability, to think its non-totality by liberating it from sheer monumentalization, but to repurpose it for pathways unseen by the past. So an adaptive artifact is an arrested historical mode of creation, since it upholds a priori historical discursive configurations as if they are complete, natural, or inevitable. And in so doing, it perpetuates a sense of historical closure. So what happens is adaptive artifacts sort of neutralize the real contingency of historical discursivity by strengthening naturalized ideals of it as an absolute and final determination. Sorry, Reza, I'm going to embarrass you here because I have a few quotes. So I know that's painful when you're, when you're in the room. So according to Reza, the intelligibility of history amounts to the experience. This is the word that was very important to me in reading this text. Amounts to the experience of a, quote, content awareness of the activities, judgments, decisions, conflicts, values, and variables, end quote, that have led to a current world configuration. So the activity of making history intelligible is an essential procedure for perceiving this contingency within a seemingly closed self-referential system. And it's due to the necessity of experiencing historical reconstruction where a vigilance against arrested historicity is required, both on the conceptual level, as with the human genre concept, but also through the tools, artifacts, and techniques used to reason and interact with the world. So this is the struggle for new histories is not a rehashing of the fetish for futurity, right? I'm trying to work against this kind of the hype of futurity that we see kind of monopolized now in the tech industry, and it's just kind of become a kind of empty buzzword. So the struggle for new histories is not a rehashing of the fetish for futurity. It is not bound to a haphazard drive of unreason towards the unknown, but rather to the conscious reconstruction of the past for paths previously unseen. So just as it is not sufficient to rest any explanation of experience on the sheer fact that it is given, the given is never an answer, yet it cannot be ignored either. It serves as a necessary point of departure. Correspondingly, conceiving the practice of art as always already the production of artifacts entails a broader consideration of their belonging to a somewhere and some when for somebody, meaning that just as it is insufficient to account for the givenness of current world configurations simply because they are given, it is equally insufficient to bypass the condition from where one begins. So such a claim resonates with Nelson Goodman's ways of world making, who wrote that new historical world configurations, quote, always starts from worlds already in hand. The making is a remaking, end quote. So remaking in this simple formulation is dependent on a robust accountability from the movement from the what isness of worlds already at hand to what could or ought to be of a remade world. One with new frames of reference that can serve as hypothetical grounds of enablement and constraint. So in accounting for this movement, a distinction can be made between futurity as mere hype or sheer rhetorical claim versus a substantial project for constructing new histories. Excuse me. Such a distinction, I think, can be elaborated through two tendencies at work in adaptive artifacts. So we're sort of setting up the negative backdrop for what will eventually become, a formation of non-adaptive artifacts. So the first kind of problem of this futurity as mere hype can be thought of as inductive stagnation. Just to be clear, not inductive logic as such, but inductive stagnation. So this is when the account of reality, or the worlds already at hand, is derived from a set of already known observable entities, including, of course, their seemingly spontaneous proper ordering, and in which a generalized pattern is unflinchingly sustained as true. So such an account occurs when the internalization of epistemic givenness, the a priori order of things, is treated as the same as the totality of worlds already at hand, without any labor of historical reconstruction. So put simply, with inductive stagnation, what there is unconsciously taken for all there can be. And the second problem of this futural hype, I like to think of as the negligent leap, in which escape from the present world is not treated as relative, but idealized as absolute from given historical discursive conditions. So here, historical givenness as this kind of point of departure I was talking about before, it's avoided through a reductive order or expeditious erasure, and the possibility of future worlds is imagined as a degree zero arrival, as if it's possible to begin from the position of a neutral nowhere and no when. So generously thought, this negligent leap may be helpful in creating fictional scenarios that can serve as provisional images of orientation, but they can only remain on the scenario level so long as those worlds are not comparatively situated from within given worlds, right? So this is a kind of an important mechanism, at least in my mind, of what is powerful potentially about counterfactuals, is they're serviced as a comparative mechanism and not just sort of isolated. So this kind of negligent leap may be convenient as a shortcut, but to leap from nowhere and no when is ultimately to evacuate what it means to have a history at all. So what's going on in futural hype is either this blind reinforcement of given historical discursive constraints, as if they serve as a complete or neutral ground of positive self-reference, or there's an avoidance of historical discursive givenness by leaping from nowhere. So neither mode provides an account of nor accountability to the relation between what is and what could or ought to be. And in the struggle for new histories, we cannot fall into either of those oversimplified traps. So as mentioned, while this provides us with a negative backdrop for what we don't want to rehearse in terms of what does not relate to what is sort of antithetical to generative aesthetics, the daunting question remains as to how one is to figure the creation of non-adaptive artifacts for new histories that are inexistent or histories not of the here and now, all the while maintaining this kind of requirement to depart, at least comparatively, from given historical configurations. So while, operations of critique, this is where this kind of idea of Foucault that we could achieve some sort of distance from the episteme is, to me, a bit dubious. So while these operations of critique may serve historical discursive reconstruction well to a certain point, the question of how to orient the remaking of worlds in the aftermath of such procedures remains unaddressed. Like, where do we go after the critique, essentially? It is inadequate to make claims on new histories as such without hypothesizing on the quality of those futures. So this is an interesting dynamic, I think, at play in the obviously admirable student-led climate strike Fridays for the Future, but of course, like, just to kind of put this word future out there without equality is also problematic. Yet this imperative to make history intelligible as the conscious awareness of the activities, judgments, decisions, conflicts, values, and variables that constitute the present doesn't necessarily offer a direction of movement towards what could or ought to be. It remains still rather diagnostic. So I think there's like two dynamics at play in this issue. So one is more of a Spinozist angle on things, wherein knowledge of generality does not affect us as strongly as knowledge through particularity. So such, quote, a particularity must be instantiated directly in concrete relations, end quote. And this is quoting Rocco Gangle. For instance, of course, we know that knowing about climate catastrophe doesn't engender the kind of mass social historical transformation required to cope with its now broadly acknowledged diagnosis. But I think the second concerns the wider ramification of knowledge as a cosmological force, one that, as Bentley Allen has analyzed, forges senses of purpose and establishes markers of orientation for political reasoning and decision making. So historically and regionally specific, cosmologies are partly composed of these epistemologies and ontologies, but it's only when those influential factors are woven into broader narratives that they are assimilated as a valence for political direction. So as a multi-level account of macro-political transformation, Allen charts the gradual uptake of paradigmatic scientific discovery like Copernicanism upon institution building, whereby they thus serve as vehicles for reproduction and internalization. So, while his study, it focuses exclusively on European scientific development, I think the takeaway is the importance of narrating the consequences of knowledge, extending its reach beyond mere acquisition, insofar as it could then set seedbeds for cosmological purposeness or give us some sense of direction outside of the purely diagnostic. So the task of non-adaptive artifacts is not only to derive these narrative consequences from historical reconstruction, but to make them available to interaction. So how to make the realm of narrative ramification, and this is of course a fictional non-given condition predicated on what could or ought to be, how do we make that amenable to situated cognition, what is in the here and now? In other words, how can non-adaptive practices not only provide the conditions of experience for a content consciousness of the current world configuration, but a mode of making otherworldly remakings intelligible and shareable in that regard? So it's in this way that non-adaptive practices are bound to the invention of counterfactual situations, understood as what David Lewis outlines as, quote, an invitation to consider what goes on at some other possible world, end quote. So through situated interactions with non-adaptive artifacts that belong to a non-actualized somewhere and somewhen else, our minds are invited to think other worlds. So conceived as anti-artifacts of counterfactual environments, said non-adaptive practices must consciously account for the a priori historical discursive conditions of a remade world as speculative conditions of enablement. So this mode of accessing new realities, not of the here and now, is driven by what Kojo Eshu named as a concept techniques. So a term that emphasizes the mutually influential entanglement between concepts and technology, concepts and artifacts. So concept techniques names a process through which that entanglement allows for the creation of new sensory experiences because concepts of the mind are shaped by interactions with artifacts. I should also note that this relates to a more this is from Kojo Eshin's 1996 book mainly concerning sonic cultures. A similar phenomena is called the artifactual mind thesis, which has a great deal of resonance. From a more sort of like cognitive science perspective, also sort of echoes a lot of these claims, which is a kind of an interesting convergence. So it's due to this relationship between the mind, tools, artifacts, and the environment that the agency of human thought may not only tinker with an escape route from the constraints of givenness, but can come to experience new realities. So this capacity for remaking worlds is premised on the speculative discursive configurations and the non-adaptive artifacts that invite interaction with those other worldly configurations. So I think I'll stop now and yeah, call it a favor. Yeah. Thanks.
Hello? Yes. Thank you, everyone. Thanks, e-flux, Brian, Amal, for inviting us and hosting us. Kisses. Thank you, Patricia and Jean-Pierre, for fantastic presentations. So I'm just going to extemporize a little bit. I think that Jean-Pierre, basically went over some of the dimensions of generative aesthetics with regard to art, and Patricia went with regard to politics and history. I want to actually go back, kind of like go for the background, for the deeper background, and saying a little bit, kind of open up why is that generative aesthetics, which of course, it's just a term. We can come up with a better term at some point for these kinds of stuff. But for now, it's just a tentative term that we use it in order to explain a certain kinds of problems. So I'm going to do this. I'm going to talk for 10, 15 minutes max. Then if Pat is with us, we'll have a conversation, me, Jean-Pierre, Pat, for like 10 minutes, and then we open it to questions and answers. So essentially, one thing that needs to be basically from the outset explained and clarified is the concept of aesthetics. What is the concept of aesthetics? So the concept of aesthetics, what we are talking about is inherited from Kant. We are not talking about aesthetics in the colloquial terms of art. Kantian aesthetics is in fact the very condition that you can in fact have artistic aesthetics. So the concept of aesthetics in Kant, as Jean-Pierre talked about, is about the organization of experience in the most general sense. You can say experience of history, as Patricia was talking about, or experience of certain kinds of qualia, like color, texture that goes into the artwork and the process of art making. Now, so this is exactly what for Kant is aesthetics, like conditions that allow for any sort of experience to be formed. Now the thing is that in the earlier on in the Critique of Pure Reason, Kant associates two organizing elements as the requisite factors for organization of any sort of experience. One is time, and the other is the space. These are not representations of time and space, in modern physical science. They are organizing principles, and they are transcendentally ideal, meaning that for Kant, they actually don't have an external reality, okay? Now, obviously, these are rules of some sort, not conceptual rules, but rules nevertheless. They are not physical laws, they are rules for Kant, because there are rules by virtue of which any sort of experience can be put together, from elementary elements of sensation or intuition, so on and so forth. Now, obviously, this is an image of a game that experience, in fact, in Kant, is put forward as if it were a game, that you had access to rules, like the game of chess. You need to have the rules in order to play it, right? So obviously, this creates a very strange kind of model of experience, but also artistic aesthetics, and also politics, in fact. Precisely if we broaden the question of experience to historical experience. Precisely because if there are these rules out there, or somehow we have some sort of access to them, and they allow us to have experience in the first place, what if these rules are kind of shaky? Or basically, there are only one version of other possible set of rules by virtue of which experience could be organized otherwise. Any sort of experience. So, I would like to read this quote from Ernst Mach to show how this can be possible. He says, in Ernst Mach, he says, in the analysis of sensations and the relation of the physical to the physical, he says, the temporal order is even more important than the spatial. Reversal of the temporal order is even more destructive of a process than is the reversal of an object in a space by turning it upside down. Reverse the temporal order, and an experience becomes something other than itself, something quite new. So, essentially, what we are dealing here with generative aesthetics is that we can think about three major aesthetic models, both philosophically and artistically, two of which we have an access already. We know quite a lot about them. But the third one is what we call generative aesthetics, which, of course, it has been talked about by philosophers. Artists have, made of pieces within the model of generative aesthetics, but it's something that has always been what you might call to be under-elaborated. It's still something of an enigma. So the three aesthetic models, in the broadest possible sense that you can think about, is first the ineffable model. So the ineffable model is based on this romantic model of language, in the sense that you cannot really fathom the depth of language, right? And so precisely because of that, there are some stuff in an artwork, in politics, in the world, that remain fundamentally and should fundamentally remain inexpressible, hence ineffable. The second one is what you might call to be the the instrumentalist model. It's essentially a very general, broad, kind of category that comprises of basically various types of art or art making, which are conceived and assumed as an instrument or a utility for either achieving or expressing ideas and or changes, political, perceptual, whatever you name it, right? So the final one is what we call generative aesthetics, which basically Jean-Pierre talked about with regard to Goodman and Flint, particularly constitutive dissociation. It's essentially, at its bottom, it's an aesthetic model, namely a model of experience that allow you to do something else, okay? Have a different kind of experience. It's an aesthetic model that has primacy over a specific aesthetic objects. For example, paintings, books, whatever you name it. In that, it is capable of functioning neither as a representation or an anti-representation manifold, representational manifold, nor as a simulation, or for that matter, dissimulation of the real world, or slices of reality, sectors of reality. It is rather about constructing or generating worlds through which the concept of one single underlying reality deteriorates, evaporates altogether. And of course, I'll come back to this. So these worlds are essentially what you might call to be emergent places, emergent topoi, emergent, basically, systems which intervene with the environment on multiple levels. They are not taking for granted an underlying reality, rather that every single notion of reality or experience of reality in any sense that we have is in fact a consequence of world making or generative aesthetics in that sense. Now, and most importantly, generative aesthetics, a good way you can think about it is the difference between play, toying around, and game. So game, in a Wittgensteinian sense, or classical Wittgensteinian sense, because this, my friend, is quite an expert in Wittgenstein, and he would object to the fact that I'm saying that the whole of Wittgenstein. I would say that early Wittgenstein, rules come first. So, like, rules are set, and then you have to follow them, you know. But play is a different thing. Play is like toying around, like Tinger toys, like how children do play, and suspend certain kinds of norms that are even given to them. It's not that they suspend them to engage in some caprice or whimsicality of experiences, but precisely to expand the cognitive perceptual resources of different kinds of worlds that might be in fact constructed. But of course they have to be tested against the elements of the world that we have right now. So one way of doing that is, I think, cognitive dissociation. Literally sabotaging the infrastructure of the game. The settled rules. You know, for example, you were talking about genre. We were talking yesterday, and I mentioned him, this idea that, so you have some sort of conventions of writing a genre novel, right? Thriller, horror, romance, so on and so forth. These genres are encapsulated by what, they tell you what to do, but most probably they actually tell you what you should not do in order to write a specific genre novel. I think that this very idea is encapsulated in the very, famous, phrase of Antoine Chekhov, Chekhov's gun. So Chekhov's idea was that, you know, if you're having a drama, please don't put a loaded gun on the stage unless it is actually going to be used in the story. So you see, it's a game, precisely because you have a rule of using a gun. The thing of a play, you can, in fact, twist Chekhov's gun, inverted Chekhov's gun. You can say that one must place a loaded rifle on the stage even if no one is thinking of using it. So, you see, you have certain kind of, basically a new attitude toward the conventions that coalesce basically the elements of genre experience. It's not as if you are doing some sort of postmodernist experience, really, but it's just that you are at a more deeper level tinker with rules. So that's one way to go about it. Another way is like Goodman's way, which I'm going to talk about. So this is a broad, kind of like idea of why generative aesthetics should be adopted as a kind of third alternative to the first two, ineffable model and the instrumentalist model of art and philosophy. Now, but of course, if aesthetics, we are defining it in the Kantian sense of the way that how I elaborated, the form of organization of experience, I think any aesthetic model first should not be answering. I mean, for you to encounter and engage with an aesthetic model, the first question that you should ask should not be about what it can do, but what kind of response is it to what kinds of problems, to what kinds of questions? Well, the questions that we are dealing here as early as Kant, and of course, Kant is kind of, in my idea, whitewashes over this problem, is that so we have experience of a stuff, color, ourselves, of the world, of ourselves in it. But what if this experience takes illusions for granted? And what if, as I mentioned earlier, that first illusion, the original illusion, is the concept of an underlying reality, the stuff out there, right? So then there are two ways for us to answer to these questions. One, to expose the delusions, the illusions of history of experience, but also the experience of history. One is the movement, as Jean-Pierre said, downstream, top-down, challenging the concepts or predicates which we project onto reality such that we can, form sensory intuition. Another one is upstream, from sensory intuition upward to the concepts. So I think that right now, neuroscience, artificial intelligence research programs are doing the upstream one, mostly, for now, in terms of neural networks, basically a study of certain kinds of injuries to the brain and possible scenarios that brain can be, at a neuroscientific level, neural level can be reformatted. So, for example, you can think, we say that we take perceptual experiences, sensory experiences for granted, like color, like shape. Like, I'm looking at Jean-Pierre and I take his face for granted. But a good example of why we should not take these stuff for granted, I'm sure that so many of you are familiar with Thomas Metzinger, the philosopher of neuroscience, and the scary chapter, which is called Deviant Phenomenological Models of Reality. So you can think about various forms of agnosia. Agnosias, of course, there are all sorts of them. It's essentially that you have a perception. It's just that that perception does not allow you to have an experience of something. For example, face blindness. I cannot literally recognize anyone's face, tell you apart from one another. I have the perception of the face, but I have no recognitive capacities to recognize this face from the other one. Or worse, a split brain, where basically, for example, I'm looking at my hand. The segments of my digits appear to be fundamentally disconnected. Like I see one segment of my digit over there by Brian, one segment at the middle of the room, and the other one closer to me. Can you imagine that your body, which is like basically the most fundamental sense of integration of the body, dissolves. And you see your different body parts basically doing the stuff in the room. So the thing is that the patients who are suffering from agnosia are actually quite normal. I mean, they can function in a kind of a normal way. But the thing is that it's precisely because they are making informed guesses, using concepts or some sort of top-down inference, form of sneaky reasoning, to, for example, tell apart their child from a dog. By, for example, distinguishing certain kinds of colors of, for example, a hair, like Jean-Pierre's hair has this, white, gray streak, and I'm basically saying that this is Jean-Pierre and it's not a chair. But the thing is that in majority of these tests, it has been shown that these informed guesses are completely wrong, even though they experience it as, basically a genuine experience, because they don't have experience in that sense. So that's what I called the upstream one. The downstream one is what Nelson Goodman calls basically projection or projectiles. So projectiles are basically like predicates that we project onto reality, such that the reality itself become the product of the labor of projection. For example, I project the predicate red to a rose. I project the predicate of, for example, rancid to some other thing, to a rotten fruit. But the thing is that Goodman shows that these are what we might call to be natural predicates, natural in the sense that they originate from our natural language. He shows that you can, in fact, create very complex predicates, which are, in fact, more accurate than predicates of red and rancid to describe, the color of a rose or the taste of a rotten apple. But nevertheless, they are never used. For example, he has obviously, things like grew. Green first, emeralds green first, and then they don't spoil, they change their color to blue. And grew or bleen, blue and then green. These projections, these complex predicates are all, in fact, more accurate to describe, and that's what science does sometimes, to, they are more accurate to describe, certain kinds of basically experiences of the world, or perceptions. But we never use them, precisely because we are habituated to our own entrenched predicates, such as red and green. But if for some reason we were habituated to different kinds of predicates, the experience that we could form was fundamentally different than ours. Just imagine that an artificial general intelligence can use different sorts of predicates with different sets of perceptual regimes, perceptual regimes. Don't you think that it's a spectrum of experience, even though can be compared with us, is fundamentally different than us? Well, you can see it. I mean, we are already seeing, kind of basically portraits, flash portraits of how this is basically unfolding. So that's one. So this is basically the basic, what you might call the core idea of generative aesthetics. So before I finish and we start the conversation, my apologies. So the idea of Goodman, idea of world making, is essentially coming from the idea that there are worlds, actual worlds, not possible worlds, in a kind of modal realist kind of way. There are actual worlds, and we are actually, these worlds have nothing to do with the concept of reality. In fact, the concept of reality for Goodman is out of the window, literally out of the window. And I'm going to say why. Because it's essentially a very useless concept. So he talks about worlds. So, for example, Jean-Pierre was saying that, for example, you can think about two statements. Earth is at rest, and Earth moves. You can think about these as two world versions, both of which, each of which support statements which are plausible and possible within its own domain, within its own horizon. So, to understand this is that according to the Ptolemaic system, to the basically geocentric system, Earth is at rest. And then the same for the second statement. According to the Copernican system or the heliocentric system, Earth is moving. Now, of course, this we need to understand that this elliptical use is quite tricky. Goodman talks about this, like, for example, that we should think about it like that. Like, kings of Sparta had only one vote, statement one, or kings of Sparta had two votes. But you can interpret it like, according to, for example, Herodotus, the kings of Sparta had one vote, two votes, and according to, for example, some Xenophons, kings of Sparta had one vote, none, or three. So essentially, what we don't get here is that these statements don't tell us anything about what Sparta is or what the Earth is, as if there is a physical Earth out there, right? That we are actually talking about it directly. We are not talking about Sparta. We are not talking about Earth within these statements. We are talking about different worlds. World versions, which basically, through which we form a vague, fuzzy idea of Earth, through which, but not by way of which. Now, this is basically, the core idea of Goodman. And we are always stuck with conflicting world versions, such as, this is a statement, Earth is moving and Earth is, basically at rest. Or you can think about in the political realm. Now, of course, there is always certain procedures by way of which we can use a world version or a system of a statement like the Earth is moving to supplant the other one, the Earth is at rest. But the whole point is not really by any means given, like as if you could just select it out of blue. No, it's a matter of construction. So world versions supplant each other or repair each other precisely because they borrow elements from old worlds and construct it such that the statements, the kinds of abilities and actions that you can do in the new world version far succeed the elements of the previous world version. Are they more reliable? Are they, for example, allow us to have the freedom of better concepts and better abilities, so on and so forth. So, to conclude, and we can of course all talk and talk about various implications of this generative aesthetics paradigm in art, politics, so on and so forth, in sciences and philosophy. But so one thing that I wanted to talk about is that I mentioned that these world versions, as if they are not like this perspective into some sort of ultimate reality. No. In fact, the moment that aesthetic becomes constructive and generative, in the sense that I mentioned earlier, the concept of reality, of an undergirding or basically underlying reality becomes redundant. Precisely because the thing is that, so we say that, for example, okay, let's assume that there is a reality of some kind of a stuff that allows us, that allows a structuring with alternative versions, as for example, a piece of, dough allows us to structure and make with cookie cutter different sorts of stuff. Now, so another way someone might actually say that, so it shouldn't be some sort of substance, some stuff out there for our versions to project a structure onto, such that we are actually talking about the same thing ultimately. Right? Now, according to Goodman, this is what he calls tolerant realist view, or coward realism. The thing is that a plurality of worlds can be versions of a unique underlying reality is also nothing but a useless addition. A reality underlying the worlds must be unstructured and neutral, and thus serves no purpose. Because if there is a stuff out there and has some sort of, kind of residues of a structure, then you are basically dealing with the myth of the given, that basically that the world has already a structure, and some mist holds some sort of a structure, and basically, it kind of impinges that structure on the mind. So a reality underlying the world must be unstructured and neutral. That's the whole point, and thus serves no purpose. If there are many equally satisfactory versions of the world that are mutually incompatible, then there is not very much left that the neutral reality could be. Reality would have no planets, because if we are really talking about neutral reality, reality wouldn't have planets, no motion, no space-time, no relation, no points, no structure at all. Then one can assume there is such a thing. But only because reality is not worth fighting for. So he says that out of the question of parsimony, but also the question of world making, or, which is a subset of generative aesthetics, we have to relinquish this bias toward an underlying reality and instead understand the logic of world making as ways of knowing, which of course should be understood under strictures, constraints, and methods which ought to be accounted for. So it is not as if we are just producing worlds for the sake of producing worlds. That's a capricious thing. Because, in fact, Goodman talks about that one world can be thought about in terms of many worlds. And many worlds can, in fact, be thought in terms of one, common integrated paradigm or one world. So that was my talk, and we open it to conversation. Thank you. Goodies? Thank you. Cheers, everyone. I'm sorry.
Are you drinking wine? It's a bit early. It's only 10 a.m. here.
So maybe Pat can say something,
Patricia, Reza.
because I know that you might have the go. So you can start.
I don't have to.
Okay.
No.
Okay.
The only thing I will say is, yeah, Patricia, the 3 full syllables. I have a trauma with the very important. That's like part of my world building exercise. So no, I'm not sure where to start. I'm still kind of processing the thing. I think the one thing that I maybe want to bring up is like when you're describing the sort of veracity of world descriptions in relation to the system of reference to which it is bound. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. I kept thinking of this. It kind of made me associate with this kind of stereoscopic image between the scientific image of the human and the manifest image of the human from Sellers, and how in a way that there's a kind of this like call for the integration. And I know it's not exactly the same, but it's the way that these descriptions of like myself as composed of atoms, the same way as any other entity in the world, even though I don't experience myself that way, that's like one sort of dimension of description. And then I have the phenomenological, let's say, experiential, which of course is conditioned by all these like predispositions and so on and so forth, biases and what have you. But just in the way that those kind of two worlds work together. And it just kind of, because, and forgive me because I am projecting my own self-interest here about this kind of like, kind of a self-understanding in this multi-dimensional space, say. And what kind of project, like, if we were to imagine our, when we're kind of imagining ourselves in this kind of, in this multi-dimensional way from various world perspectives. How does that sort of integration work? Perhaps is a more interesting, because that's a kind of point that you ended on, right? And just sort of briefly touched on that it's possible to have an integrated world that is composed of many different worlds.
You want to answer?
The-
You go.
No, it's not really an answer. I just like the mention of, you know, it's not really an answer, I think. I think it touches upon the same questions I have with this kind of project, which is has something to do with this integrative dimension and maybe this possibility of thinking of these several worlds as being integrated into one as well, and also Sellers' picture of, you know, the difference between scientific image and manifesto image as a particular case of this, in a sense, because what seems to be happening in Sellers that is different from Goodman is the fact that these two different images, which are also cases of integrative worlds, in the sense that the scientific image, he says, as he says in the beginning of Philosophy and Scientific Image of Man, the scientific image is already a coalition of different partial images, right? At the same time, there is this historical dimension of the emergence of the scientific image. So, in a sense, what I always wonder regarding the differences between Sellers and Goodman, differences that touch upon this question of the integrative one world, is how, if the historical dimension, the temporal dimension of the derivation of one world from another is kind of responsible for a retroactive unification, in a sense. This is one question. And the other questions I have, it seems like I'm criticizing the whole premise of the evening, but yeah, I have my own questions about this. And the second question, I think, that is, we were talking yesterday, right, Reza, about this, and even today, in the morning, about the question of the criteria of functioning of a world. Like Goodman talks about fitness. And
not truth. Really.
Not truth. It's correction. Correction is one word of it, yeah. But also the word must fit. And it's kind of mysterious. What does it mean that a world fits?
Fits in, yeah.
Fits in, yeah. It's kind of mysterious. Yeah. At the same time, this has another question like imbricated into it. That is the question of constraints. What are the constraints?
What are the constraints? Yes.
For the constitution of different roles. So all of this is kind of pointing towards this integrative dimension, which it's kind of a slippery slope towards, you know, the picture of one underlying world.
Yes.
So it's kind of, there are two dangers there. One danger is we don't want to go there and have, go back to the Aristotelian picture, in a sense, but also we don't want to go to a full relativism wherein you have no constraints whatsoever, yes. And you can't, for instance, answer adequately to a flat earther, for instance. Yeah, because a flat earther the flat earthers has their own, have their own coherence and fitness. So, if you want to comment on that, I mean,
sure.
I think I was just adding to Patricia's question.
So much. Thank you, both of you. I would just say something, and then we open it to question and answers because it's running late. So, the thing is that I think generative aesthetics and ways of world making is one of the most radical, basically, I think, ideas that still, as I mentioned, hasn't been explored in art, in politics, in philosophy, precisely because obviously it has all of those implications. How do you go about thinking about future worlds for future generations? Are they going to live in the same shitty world that we live in? So obviously there is a kind of a construction labor that should go into the practice of first imagining a possible world for future generations, and such that we go and constructing. And of course, we can test them, against the harsh reality of our own world. The same thing about art, the same thing about philosophy. But here, there are some pitfalls here. One, that it might lead to certain kind of irrationalism, precisely because you don't have canonical criteria of truth. You don't have criteria of consistency. It's just fitness, okay? So, well, of course, fitness for Goodman is also, quite very a complex term. It's perceptual noetic. But the thing is that, so this is Putnam's critique, Hilary Putnam's American philosopher's critique of Goodman, is that so imagine that there are two conflicting statements within two different world versions. So how are you actually knowing that they are actually talking about the same thing? Not the same reality, not because we basically throw reality or substance out of the window, but are they actually talking about the same thing as linguistic thing? Putnam, Goodman might say that, we can actually see a kind of, that they are sharing the same kind of meaning behavior, or they have some sort of meaning relation with one another. So, but then Putnam would answer to Goodman that, so then this becomes again another version of truth that you got rid of, precisely because you are taking meaning as intra-world component, which is basically set in advance, like a rule of the game, and so basically you are cheating now. So one, irrationalism, two, relativism, and three, kind of greedy pluralism. I think one of the greatest thing about Goodman is methodological pluralism.
You're forgetting bald realism.
Sorry?
Bald realism.
Yes.
Like a fourth thing.
Yes. So there are these pitfalls. I think that these are the issues that ought to be addressed, precisely because they have consequences. You can think about it, fake truth scenarios right now, post-truth. You can think it about in terms of lived experience, who has a more authentic lived experience or has a, this and that. So these are actually part of this, what we might call to be diorama of problems that generative aesthetics try to deal with. So, please, anyone? Sure, I can.
Reza, I want to read you this quote. Reza, I want to read you this quote from Kant's idea for a universal history with a cosmopolitan aim, and then relate it to generative aesthetics. Can one regard the history of the human species in the large as the completion of a hidden plan of nature to bring about an inwardly and, to this end, also an externally perfect state constitution, as the only condition in which it can fully develop all its predispositions in humanity? So from Heraclitus' flux to Plato's craftsmanship, this idea of the ineffable, this idea of, which begins perhaps like visually in fire, but starts working its way through techniques, through tool making, and in some versions, such as Andy Clark's sort of representational, extensive, limitivist mind, is inflected as mental processes. We see, flux is something that's bound to world making as an internal condition. My question has to do with Kant, and then sort of something that happens in between Kant and Hegel, and intelligence's relation to the generative. In Kant, with beauty and the sublime, we have a phenomenologically bound idea of the aesthetic. The sublime being more so apperceptive reasons, limitations, and beauty being something more communal. But with the Dasein of Geist, with the experientially organized synthesis of spirit, geistig, in Hegel, we get both a synthesis and, as an intelligence and spirits, and this separation from the bounds of the earth, from this cruel nihilism, where intelligence continues without being materially bound. Can the aesthetic too, in some sense, continue? Can the aesthetic as well generate beyond the materially bound, beyond this cruel nihilist picture, much like intelligence?
No, absolutely not. Precisely because Jean-Pierre or Pat, Patricia, Keith, might have different ideas, but I think that my aesthetics fundamentally is tied to what Husserl would call material noetic poles. So, precisely because aesthetic, you should understand that Kant, in fact, builds aesthetic from perception. But of course, he's not building it purely bottom up. So it's bottom up material, but also it's noetic, basically conceptualization or projections of predicates that we project onto reality or percepts. So I don't think, no, absolutely. But of course, the question then hinges on the idea of, okay, what do we mean by materiality? Not matter, materiality. I think these are kind of like fundamental questions that should be answered. To be honest with you, surprisingly, you are in the class. I actually like Deleuze's take on materiality, because Deleuze never talks about matter. Deleuze talks about materiality. Talking about materiality is very different than talking about matter, as if there is like some, fundamental stuff out there, right? Materiality is also a construct, but nevertheless, it is a construct strictured by sensory processing, by sensation.
Yeah, I would comment on that. Just brief comment that this question of materiality also paves the way for a kind of answer that is not a negative answer per se, maybe a positive one that has to do with a further question. That is, what are the constraints? What are the conditions that how intelligence can be instantiated in a different, so to speak, substrate? Substrate, I'm understanding substrate as a theoretical construct as well, not as something out there, but can intelligence be, can aesthetics, be instantiate or be implemented in a sense, or can it result from another different substrate? So if you understand the materiality in this sense, perhaps there is an escape route. We just don't know what it is. We don't know which constraints are capable of giving rise to the aesthetical dimension in the Kantian sense, this, zigzag, Deleuze likes this word, between, concepts and the conceptual and the sensible. So in a sense, I'm not that negative regarding this issue. Okay, so maybe Patricia wants to add something.
No, I'm fine. I don't have so much to say.
Thanks everybody for the great talk. I have a question from Reza specifically. So just making sure that I've understood what you said. You started with concept of aesthetics, and then you said you pointed out this given like rules that Kant creates, and you say that it's okay. He creates a game of aesthetics, right? And you're like, we're gonna take another path and not playing Kant's game, right? Right. Okay. Like the game of football. You don't want to play the game of football. You want to change the rules of the game. You don't want to play that with food. You want to change the ball. You want to change the goals. It's not football anymore. How can you change the rule of aesthetics and still call it aesthetics? I like the generative next to aesthetics, but for me it's more like alternative aesthetics, or like the same way that alternative fact or alternative reality feels like. If you don't want to play the game of football, you cannot create another game and set constructive rules. Still, by rejecting the rules of football, you are creating another rules. Right.
Hence, you are making a new world.
Yeah, exactly. And
that is the whole, what you might call to be a paradigm of aesthetics that allows us to have different world versions, rather than merely subjecting us to basically having one world of experience, of football, of chess. And this is like the whole point. I mean, for example, you see, like when children play with toys, obviously, you know, they presuppose both what and when determines X and Y factors. But in addition, they introduce what you might call to be a Z factor, like, you know, an additional third, for a complex decision involving what play can possibly be. One, instead of representing, using the existing rules, representing the world and taking it for granted, for example, the world of football, or for example, think about the world of, Keplerian mechanics. So they represent certain kinds of elliptical motions of celestial bodies. So instead of we are living in this world and simply settling for the representational resources that it gives us, we begin to extemporize, exemplify, extemporization and exemplification versus representation or anti-representation. So that's the first thing that we do. Then we basically, we follow some of the actually rules of football to get the idea, but also we create new strategies.
Like kids?
My favorite example would be a Lego model. You get a Lego model. So the kid gets the birthday gift, it's Death Star, right? But instead of making a Death Star, makes a dragon out of it.
Okay.
Can I add to this?
Yeah, sure.
Though? Because it kind of relates to a problem that I've been trying to figure out or work through as well. Maybe somebody has some idea about this, but it's a threshold question, and it's precisely the if we take that statement that, you know, new worlds are composed of the worlds already at hand, every making is a remaking. So how do we know when we are just rearranging the furniture? And how do we know when we've constituted a new world, a new world with frames of reference? So basically the question in terms of football would be, at what threshold do the rules get reorganized to such a degree that it's no longer identifiable as football, and we've reconstituted the game, versus minor adjustments where people familiar with football could kind of pick it up and get it, and so you could say to be just rearranging the furniture. So like, how do we come to identify that threshold?
Right. So I think the answer to this is that precisely because, goodbye, thank you so much for everything. So basically, the answer is precisely this. Because the new football, which is not football anymore, enables us to posit certain kinds of statements, enables us to have certain kinds of actions which we couldn't otherwise have if we were basically in the football game. Essentially, you can think about this again like Newton versus Copernicus. Newtonian mechanics allow you to have certain kinds of predictions about the motion of celestial bodies, configuration of the constellation, so on and so forth, that Copernicus' system otherwise couldn't afford you those things. So you are essentially in a different world now, a world version.
Yeah, regarding the question of, actually it's a question of the boundary, right? You're asking about the boundary between one thing and the other, how much change one thing can undergo before it becomes another thing. Well, incidentally, my philosopher from my heart, that is Wittgenstein, used the game as the example precisely of such a how do you say that? I'm distracted.
Threshold question.
How do you say that? Proliferating traits. So it all amounts to how do you view also language and the conceptualizing, so to speak, game. So for Wittgenstein, game is the paradigm of a family resemblance concept. That means there are no necessary and sufficient conditions to determine that something is a game or not. So why I call it proliferating traits, because from A to B you can go through one property, but property B is not conserved. From B to C you go through property B, but property A is not conserved, and so on. So, of course, you are in a philosophical, so to speak, mode. Then in the philosophical mode, we ought to try to make the distinctions to the best of our capacities. But I would say such distinctions come, in a sense, after the fact. And this has consequences also for the stuff that I was talking in the sense of constitutive dissociations and this kind of thing. Because what a constitutive dissociation is a parasitic act. You have something that is constituted through a certain practice that is a protocol that is operating in the world already. And then you destroy the protocol, but in an inscrutable way. So you don't know if the protocol is the same or not. And I would paraphrase Reza, and he says, like, you could put a gun in a scene, even if nobody's using the gun. I would say you put the gun in the scene, particularly because no one is using it. So you have a weird situation, in a sense. Of course, this is capricious also. You say, you want to devise like weird situations for the sake of it. You don't know how they will coalesce. So in a sense, it is a kind of ad hoc decision, whether you draw a boundary or not. And of course, there are reasons for it and reasons against it. I mean, you can argue about boundaries, but it's not a given that I don't think we can answer for once and for all time that under what conditions A becomes B, and we can't really call A anymore. We can only answer this locally. So there you go. There's a kind of according to certain parameters. Yes, that would be my answer to this issue.
Can I say the last thing? And
Sure. I think there is a different question. Okay,
I
sorry.
just want to say that I don't think there is anything wrong with the structure of the game, and that's the players that create a beautiful and interesting game. And yeah, that's it.
Yes, but that's the whole point that, you see, when we are talking about games in this sense, which is kind of like Elie Wittgenstein, okay, yeah. But also you can say that the whole idea that rules, yes. 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 So, so basically, the thing is that is the whole point. That you can play with the game, but playing with the game, breaking it and create another game, another world version. But playing in a game is very different from playing with the game, toying around with the game. So playing in the game is essentially that your any sort of game, any sort of rule allows you certain scope or certain what you might call to be tolerance of actions and noematic acts like cognitions, right? Which, of course, not all players who play football have access to those, and they can be, in fact, explored, but to a limit. That is the point.
JP, this is directed towards you bringing up Henry Flint. Mainly, I guess my understanding of some of the social context that Flint is coming from is, and also Tony Conrad is dealing with a kind of critique of authorship, specifically Lamont Young, the way he controlled his music.
Yep.
With Tony Conrad, that went on to kind of, with Viritol, be against the composer, against certain authorship. With Flint, that went into the Veramusement, that whole.
That's a good one.
Yeah, I was curious for what everyone might think about how ways of world making, what that could look like, kind of fully invested with a critique of authorship involved. Yeah. And what, on the one hand, maybe it invoking a critique of authorship not just as an acceptance of whatever predicates are readily available, but on the other hand, maybe including, also a critique of authorship that is revolutionary in the production of new world versions or this type of thing.
Yeah, that's a fantastic question. Thank you. First of all, I think the critique of authorship put forward by Tony Conrad is quite feeble, because and it's kind of the same critique of authorship that one could take from Cage. They are still like signing everything, and just because you have an ensemble and you distribute somewhat agency and you still have copyright control over what you're doing, this kind of, I don't think this is a good example of a constitutive dissociation in a sense, right? And I don't think it's a radical enough critique. I'm a fan of Tony Conrad's, but regarding that specific issue, of course, his critique is more local. I think it's more like, okay, Lamont Young wants to say that, nevertheless, the theater of eternal music was a kind of communal music practice. He wants to take avail of the results and say that, it was all me. Of course, but then in that sense, it's a more local critique, not a global critique towards what authorship means and, you know, all this kind of stuff. I have actually I have done some experiments trying to remove authorship altogether. For instance, I won't say the name of the stuff that we did, because it would defeat its purpose. But we had like a project, and I don't know who's doing records with the project, who is part of the project, who is not. We don't know, nobody knows. What happens is, for this to function, this has to be, there are two operations. First, you have to generate interest in taking part in an activity that is constitutively dissociated. I'm getting distracted. In an activity that is constitutively dissociated. I'm getting further distracted. No, it's me. I'm not worried if people are listening. I'm kind of, you know, have this, yeah, whatever. You have to generate interest in this, in a sense, and nobody will click anything that has not an author or a name that motivates the clicking. So it is really a kind of critique that goes completely against the grain of what, you know, music business is or art business is. That is completely, utterly motivated by the circulation of names, you know. So it has a name, the stuff. Not my name, obviously, or not the name of anybody that did stuff for this stuff. But there is a second level to it. The first level is to generate interest enough so people take part in it. And the second level is, if you are doing something that is anonymous, it has to be not just to be anonymous, it has to be visible as anonymous. And something that is anonymous is invisible. So you have to make that invisibility visible. So this is an issue. So we are trying several things, like the first idea was to post everything on the deep web and just, you know, publish like one of those addresses that are a string of symbols and people could retrieve it there. But, you know, this went too far. This is not visible. So this is really a problem. There is, and it's an interesting example because it puts like, it makes explicit what are the issues, not with constitutive dissociation per se, but with specific cases of constitutive dissociation, wherein what you are doing is really beating against like a wall, like is living a contradiction that defeats the purpose of what you are doing. So there is a kind of science or art of constitutive dissociations in the sense of experimenting how to do them. And if they are, you know, if they have a kind of, if they, how to say, keep standing or not. I mean, if they are defeated by the contradiction that they are putting forward or not. This is an issue, effectively. Yeah, but this is my very personal response to your question. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you.